Okay, so if you've got a track that's really sort of losing clarity with the elements, there's not much separation between the sounds, they're fighting for space, you know, it's quite muddy, or the elements that you've got in there are just kind of getting lost amongst everything else. Today I'm going to show you a way that I look at mixing down my tracks later on when all the elements are in there to sort of give that separation and clarity between the sounds. So let's get straight into it. Okay, so before we get into this, if you are looking for mixing tips, tutorials, more in-depth tutorials on mixdowns and sort of getting your sounds to sit better in your mix, then I'll leave some links in the description below for a mixdown tutorial and one which is also layering and adding depth to your tracks, which will also help with this sort of thing as well. So what I've got here is I've got Ableton's EQ open, and this is just going to be a visual aid to try to explain to you exactly how I kind of look at elements within a mix. So when it comes to a trance track, for example, they can be very busy. You've got a lot of stuff that sort of sits in this mid-range sort of area here. You know, you'll have plucks, acids, basses, and other sounds that sort of sit in here. So there's a lot that goes into a trance track that sits around here. So they have to sit nicely together. Now, obviously, we have to think about frequency, but we also have to think about time. So, you know, something can cover the same frequency range that's hitting here and the same frequency range sitting here as this hits if this has stopped. So there is two things to think about with this when it comes to frequency and time. But when we come to adding in new elements, one thing that I see a lot of my clients is they're adding in, you know, acids, basses and plucks and stuff like that, but they're all kind of sitting in that same sort of frequency range and they're all sort of fighting for space. So what these little EQ dots are here, I'm going to use these as a visual aid for you to think about these sounds. So let's say, for example, this is our acid, this is our pluck, and this is our bass, right? Let's just say that they're roughly sitting in this mid-range area. They're all sort of occupying these frequencies sort of here. So if we are adding in sounds, right, so we've got our bass, or it doesn't really matter which ones they are, it's just a visual aid to show you what I mean. So we can have our bass, we can have our acid, and we can have our plucks, right? Now, these are all going to start fighting for space, right? So, and the issue with this as well is we might have a plucks layer that's got 3 layers in it, and we might have an acid layer that's got 3 layers in it, and then we've got our bass, right? So there's a lot of elements there that can start to fight for space. So once I've got all my elements in my track, and I do this towards the end if it's needed, because you can only do what I'm about to tell you once the other elements are in the track, because you need something to sort of go off. You know, you can't say to yourself, well, I need to maybe put this up an octave or this down an octave, because if there's nothing else to go off, then it's not really fighting anything against anything at that point. So what we've got to think about here is the positioning of these and the octaves that these are sitting in. So let's say, for example, all of these 3 sounds all have a similar sort of fundamental frequency. Now, again, I'm not using this as exact where the frequency should be. I'm just using these to kind of show you the buildup of sounds in a particular area. So, for example, let's say our bass has got 3 different layers. In that bass section, we could have 3 different layers, right? Now, you might separate them from low, mid to high. That's great. You're separating the sounds, and you're essentially doing something like this. So you're splitting them across the frequency range, right? But if you're not doing that, and you're just adding 3 layers that all have the same sort of frequency ranges in them, you're going to get something like this, right? So let's just pretend these are all the 3 bass layers. All those 3 bass layers are going to be fighting for the same frequencies, unless you've got sort of like, you know, different patterns that are playing at different times. But you can see here how things start to build up as a visual aid, how the basses can start to fight for space. Now, this is just the basses. Then you've got acids. Then you've got plucks, right? So by the time you add in all these sounds into this same sort of frequency range, you're going to get issues. Now, this is why it's a good idea for the likes of like bass, plucks and acids, is to have if you've, let's say as an example, you've got 3 different layers in each of them, is to have like a lower frequency, mid-range frequency, and a higher frequency. One that's going to give it depth, but it's also going to stop big build-ups of frequencies getting all pushed into the same spot. So let's say, for example, our plucks. So now we've got a pluck layer lower down, a pluck layer in the mid, and then a pluck layer higher up as a visual aid. We're now sort of separating those frequencies across the frequency range, because we only have so many frequencies to work with, right? So it depends on how we want to fill them. So now we've got a pluck low, pluck mid, pluck high. And let's say we've got the same for an acid. Acid low, acid mid, acid high, bass low, bass mid, bass high, right? So now the highs are only having to contend with another sound here in this frequency range, right? The same with the mid range and the same with the lower mid. But there's one thing to think about when it comes to this is, so now we've only got 2 layers in this sort of region, right? But each of those sounds, although we class them as, say, 1 layer, inside the actual synth, that could be made up of multiple different octaves, in which case we're getting multiple different layers within inside that synth as well. Now, if you're good at picking sounds, this will generally kind of happen naturally. You might have a pluck sound that's, you know, maybe got 2 octaves below in one oscillator, 1 octave higher in the second oscillator, and then 1 higher, for example, in the other one. So it's naturally splitting those frequencies across that sound anyway. But the issue that I see when I open up some people's presets and clients' tracks that have this issue where all the sounds are just getting lost within the mix is it's all sort of sitting on the same octave. So you can come into your synth, and this is what I do when all the elements are there. I'll come to my sound and I'll listen to the sounds that it's clashing with, and not in solo, I will play like my bass and my acid together. And if my acid is sort of fighting for space with that mid bass, for example, I will go into either the acid or the bass, and I'll move these oscillator octaves around, because I'm going to get much more sort of micro sort of movement by going into the oscillators. Now, you can obviously go in and push up the MIDI an octave, for example, and that can create space for that sound. But there's some times where you might push the MIDI up an octave and it's then too bright. It's not how you wanted it, right? So the reason why I go into the oscillator octaves and change them is I'll bring the MIDI back down to where it was, and then I can fine tune a lot more, because it might just be one particular oscillator that is clashing with either the acid or the bass. And I can then go in and test. It's not always going to work. You know, sometimes there's a particular sound that you want and you want it to sound exactly like that. But you got to think about it not in solo and in the mix. Now, it could be that this is an acid sound and there's a particular oscillator that's fighting for space with the bass. Now, it could be that I figure out which oscillator it is by playing around, moving some of them an octave up or octave down. And I've been able to then move that acid up without the whole MIDI going up, because when you drag up the whole MIDI, every oscillator is coming up an octave, whereas you've got more granular control if you go into each of the oscillators and move them up or down a bit. So it's sort of really is like Da Vinci coding each sort of sound into the mix. And being able to push them up bit by bit almost, without pushing the whole MIDI up. And what you'll find is, if, for example, we had, this is a visual aid of the bass, and our acid was like this, yes, we could push it up an octave in the frequency range, but it could be, again, this is just a visual aid. I'm trying to really drive that home because I don't want people saying, that's not the exact frequency or anything like that. It could be that this is going up. So this is the acid going up an octave. It's too high, but it was kind of fighting for space here with this sound. So when we move one or two of the oscillator octaves up or down, we're moving it out the way, so that it's giving a bit more space. Now, what this is going to do is going to move that sound out of the way, and rather than chasing your tail and EQing the bass sound, for example, like trying to boost it in an area where it's clashing, we've instantly moved something out of the way and allowed that bass to now shine through. Therefore, not having to boost something that didn't need boosted in the first place. We've just given it the room that it needed. So obviously, just going back to all these sounds, like again, we've got bass, plucks, acids, for example. You've got to try and remember, if these have all got 3 layers in each one, that's 9 sounds. And then if each of them have got 3 different oscillators in each sound, you're looking at 27 different layers if they're all sat on the same octave range. Now, as I say, a lot of presets won't do that. Some will be an octave down or an octave up or whatever to sort of split the frequencies across the sound to make it sound more in depth, but that's not always the case. People might be using presets that aren't like that. So it's just something to think about. So when you start to add in all these sounds, like for example, you know, if you look at all these as all the different oscillators in each of the different sounds, it can quickly start to build up. So that's why I'm saying when you get to the end of your track and you've got all your elements in there, you can hear what's fighting for space with what. Go into each of the oscillators in each of your elements that are clashing and try moving them around. You know, some might need to go up 1 octave, some might need to go down an octave, some might need to go down 2 octaves, but basically it's allowing more space for each of those sounds to sit within that range. So I hope this makes sense. I've tried to, it makes sense in my head, but hopefully it does in yours too. If you've got any questions, be sure to write a comment in the description below and I'll try to help you out more if certain things haven't made sense. But yeah, these nodes were just sort of used as a representation of the buildup of sounds within a particular frequency range. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the video. As I say, if you've not yet subscribed to the AIM Studios Trance Production community, I'll leave a link in the description below. And you get free tips, tutorials and stuff like this, and also discount codes and special offers, free sample packs and free MIDI and stuff like that inside when you join. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I hope it's helped. Please don't forget to subscribe and like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.